Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to jump into the early life and ideas of, well, a truly monumental figure, Karl Marx.
Absolutely. It's a topic that came up from you, our listener, actually. There's so much curiosity about where his ideas came from, his enduring influence.
Exactly. And to get to grips with that, we're using a really interesting source, the Vietnamese Wikipedia entry on him. It gives a great overview of his early development.
It really does. And it reminds us he wasn't just one thing, was he? Philosopher, economist, historian, sociologist, political theorist.
Journalist, too.
Wait, no.
And a revolutionary, obviously.
Right. And you've got the big works, the Communist Manifesto, Das Kapital. They still loom so large.
Definitely. But today, our mission, if you like, isn't to tackle Das Kapital head-on or map out his entire political life.
No, it's more focused than that.
Yeah, we want to dig into those crucial early years. Where did it all start? What were the key experiences and ideas that formed the foundation?
Kind of like an archaeological dig of his early thought.
Precisely. Extracting those key bits, those intriguing details from his youth and early career to give you a solid grasp of where it all began. So let's start right at the beginning, shall we?
Okay. So, Karl Heinrich Marx, born May 5th, 1818, Trier, Prussia.
And the family background, that's interesting straight away, isn't it? The Jewish roots, but then conversion to Christianity.
Yeah, before he was born, his father, Heinrich, was a lawyer and quite influenced by the Enlightenment classical liberalism.
Which is fascinating, given where Marx ended up intellectually.
Totally. His dad was advocating for a constitution in Prussia, which was, quite progressive then, a state under absolute rule.
And his mother, Henriette Pressburg, there was a significant business connection there?
Yes, quite. Her family was Dutch, Jewish, pretty wealthy. They actually founded Philips Electronics.
No kidding, Philips.
Yep. Her sister Sophie married Lion Philips, and, Gerard and Anton Philips, Fritz Philips later on, their descendants.
Yeah.
And the irony, or maybe just a curious detail, is that later, when Carl and Jenny were struggling in London, they often got loans from Lion Philips, his uncle-in-law.
So a link to the very capitalist system he'd critique so fiercely.
Exactly. It adds a layer, doesn't it? These contrasting influences right from the start.
It really does. Okay, what about his education? Sounds like even school wasn't immune to the politics at the time.
Not at all. He was homeschooled first until 1830, then went to the Trier Gymnasium.
And the headmaster there?
Hugo Wittenbach, a friend of Marx's father, actually, and he hired liberal humanist teachers.
Ah, so that caused ripples.
Big ripples. The government got suspicious. They actually raided the school in 1832.
A police raid on a school?
Yeah, looking for liberal political stuff circulating among students. It led to staff changes, as you'd expect.
So this early brush with censorship, with authority clamping down, that must have left a mark.
You'd have to think so. A skepticism towards authority, maybe, fueling that radical spark. It wasn't just theoretical for him, you see. It was happening around him.
Makes sense. A real-world education in politics alongside the formal stuff. Then university, if his father wanted a lot, right?
That was the plan. 1835, University of Bonn. Marx was 17, probably more interested in philosophy literature.
But Dad said law. Practicalities?
Pretty much. Though at Bonn, he seems to have embraced student life, joined the Radical Artists Club. Police were watching them, apparently.
Oh, really?
And the Trier Tavern Club. Got involved in a duel, even.
A duel, okay.
Yeah. So maybe not the most focused student initially. His grades weren't great.
Right.
Which led his father to insist he transfer. University of Berlin, 1836. More serious, more academic.
But still drawn to philosophy.
Oh, absolutely. Even while studying law, philosophy, and literature were his real passions. You get that sense of tension, right? Family expectations versus personal intellectual drive.
Definitely a relatable struggle.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, moving into a really pivotal period. His engagement and diving deep into Hegel.
Yeah, this seems to be where things really start to crystallize for him intellectually. Summer and autumn of 1836, back in Trier, he gets engaged to Jenny von Westphalen.
They'd known each other since childhood.
Yes. She was from a noble, though fairly liberal, family. Her choosing Marx over a noble suitor apparently caused a bit of a stir. Different backgrounds, religion, class.
Social hurdles.
Big ones. But Marx became friends with her father, Ludwig von Westphalen, who was quite liberal himself, and that helped smooth things over. They eventually married in 1843.
A romance against the odds, in a way. And then Berlin immersing himself in Hegel.
Right. October 1836, he moves to Berlin. Officially law, but philosophy was pulling him hard. He attended lectures by key figures, Edward Gans, who was a progressive Hegelian,
Okay.
and Carl von Savigny from the Historical School of Law. But Marx himself felt, without philosophy, nothing can be achieved.
So Hegel became central.
Hugely central. Hegel was the philosopher then. Everyone was engaging with his ideas. Marx gets ill, recovers, and joins the Doctor Club.
Doctors Club.
Yeah, basically a student group obsessed with discussing Hegel.
And this club led him to the young Hegelians. That sounds important.
Hugely important. He joins them around 1837. Thinkers like Ludwig Feuerbach, Bruno Bauer, they were part of this very radical group.
What was their take on Hegel?
Well, they kind of took Hegel's method, the dialectic, this idea of history moving through contradictions.
Right, the thesis, antithesis, synthesis thing.
Sort of, yeah. But they ditched Hegel's more metaphysical or idealist side. They weren't focused on some abstract spirit-driving history.
They were more grounded.
Much more.
Mm-hmm.
They used the dialectic to critique real-world stuff.
Hmm.
Society, politics, religion, poverty. They turned Hegel's system into a tool for social critique. It was quite revolutionary, really.
Taking the engine, but driving it somewhere completely different. Fascinating. He was also writing creatively around this time. Novels, plays.
He was experimenting, yeah. Around 1837, a novel, Scorpion and Felix, a play, Ulanum, love poems for Jenny, none published in his lifetime, though.
But it shows the breadth of his interests.
Absolutely. He later focused more on languages, English, Italian, Latin art history, translation. He even worked with Bruno Bauer editing Hegel's Philosophy of Religion.
And then his PhD. That seems like a key step.
Definitely. His dissertation, completed in 1841, the difference between the Democritean and Epicurean philosophy of nature.
Quite a title. What was the core argument?
Basically arguing for philosophy's superiority over theology. Pretty controversial stuff.
So, not submitted at Berlin.
No. The climate there was getting more conservative.
Mm-hmm.
He sent it to the University of Jena, which was known for being more liberal, and they awarded him the PhD in April 1841.
And he and Bauer even planned an atheist journal.
Yeah, Archives of Atheism, planned for March 1841. It never happened, but wow, just the idea tells you how radical they were being, the risk involved.
Definitely pushing boundaries. So even before formal journalism, he's making waves, which brings us to the Rheinische Zeitung.
Right, Cologne, 1842, he starts writing for this radical paper, and this is where you really see his early socialist ideas coming out and his interest in economics growing.
And he wasn't shy about criticism.
Not at all. He went after right-wing European governments, criticized liberals and socialists he thought weren't effective. He's grappling with real-world politics now, facing censorship directly.
You mentioned censorship. How bad was it?
Pretty intense. Marx himself described it. Every issue had to go to the police to be sniffed at, as he put it. If they smelled anything un-Christian or un-Prussian, it was banned.
Wow. Sniffed at.
Yeah. And eventually, the paper criticized the Russian Tsar, Nicholas VII.
Oh.
Yep. The Tsar complained, and the Prussian government shut the paper down. 1843.
So out of a job. And out of Germany, essentially,
right.
Which leads him to Paris.
Exactly. Paris in 1843, a real hub of radical thought then. He becomes co-editor of a new journal, the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbücher, the German-French Annals.
With Arnold Rouge.
With Rouge, yeah. The idea was to link up German and French radicals. Marx and Jenny moved there in October 43.
Did it work? Bringing French and German thinkers together?
Not really, as it turned out. It was mostly German contributors. The only non-German was Mikhail Bakunin, the Russian anarchist.
But Marx wrote some key pieces for it, things that really signaled his developing communism.
Absolutely crucial essays. Contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of law, and maybe even more significantly, on the Jewish question.
Why is that one so important?
Because it's where he first explicitly identifies the proletariat, the working class, as the force for revolution. That's a major marker of his shift towards communism.
A really decisive step. But the journal itself didn't last long.
No, just one issue. It got some attention, partly thanks to poems by Heinrich Heine.
The satirical poet.
That's him. But the German states banned it, Rouge pulled the funding, and that was the end of the journal, and unfortunately his friendship with Marx too.
So another setback. What did he do next in Paris?
He started writing for Vorwärts, Forward, another radical German paper in Paris. It had ties to the League of the Just.
An early communist group.
Sort of proto-communist secret society at that stage. Marx was really honing his socialist views then, building on Hegel, on Feuerbach's materialism, critiquing others. He went to their meetings but didn't formally join yet.
And Paris is also where the meeting happened, right? With Engels?
Yes. August 28th, 1844. Café de la Régence. He meets Friedrich Engels. And that's the start of, well, history in a way. A lifelong friendship, an incredible intellectual partnership.
Engels must have had a big impact right away.
He did, especially with his book, The Condition of the Working Class in England. It gave Marx this incredibly detailed, first-hand look at industrial capitalism and its effects on workers. Really seems to have sharpened Marx's focus on material conditions on the proletariat.
A pivotal encounter.
Yep.
But Marx couldn't stay in Paris either, could he?
No, his writings for Vorwärts got him kicked out again. In February 1845, he ends up in Brussels. Couldn't go back to Germany, couldn't stay in France.
And the condition for staying in Belgium?
He had to promise not to publish anything on contemporary politics.
Did that stick?
Well, Brussels quickly became a magnet for other exiled socialists. Moses Hess, Karl Heinz, and Joseph Wedemeyer. Marx connected with them. And then Engels joined him there in April 45.
So the collaboration continued, intensified even. They wrote The Holy Family together there.
They did, yeah. Published in 1845, it was basically their big critique of Bruno Bauer and some of the other young Hegelians they felt hadn't gone far enough or were stuck in idealism. They were moving beyond Feuerbach now, forging their own path.
And this Brussels period, it was incredibly productive for Marx intellectually, wasn't it? Developing his theory of history.
Hugely productive. He just dives into study. Political economy, Smith, Ricardo, James Mill, French utopian socialists, Saint-Simon, Fourier, French history. It's like all the pieces are coming together.
The synthesis moment.
Exactly. Hegelian dialectics, French socialism, English economics. This is where Marxism as a distinct framework really starts to take shape.
You mentioned Feuerbach. Marx wrote something specific about him around then, too.
Yes, the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844 explored things like alienated labor, but he later felt they were still a bit too influenced by Feuerbach.
Right.
So shortly after moving to Brussels, April 1845, he jots down the theses on Feuerbach.
The famous 11 Theses, especially number 11.
Philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. Just perfectly captures that shift towards praxis, towards action.
It really does. What else was key in those theses?
It's his critique of materialism that just, looks at the world, and also a critique of idealism that ignores the material world. He's laying out the basics of historical materialism, saying it's not ideas that drive history, but material conditions, what people do, how they produce things.
The economic base determining the superstructure, essentially.
That's the core idea taking root. It's about real physical activity shaping society, not just abstract thought.
But his radical activities, even if he promised not to publish on politics, they still cause problems.
Well, his association with Vorwärts had already led to his expulsion from France, remember, at the Prussian king's request. That constant pressure being pushed from place to place, it probably just strengthened his revolutionary convictions.
You'd think so.
Yeah.
And in Brussels, he reconnected with the League of the Just.
He did. And he pushed them hard to change. He argued against their sort of secret society model, said they needed to be an open political organization, mobilizing workers across Europe for revolution.
And they listened.
They did. His arguments won out. In June 1847, the League of the Just transformed into the Communist League, openly political, focused on working class.
And Marx and Engels were central to this, defining its aims.
Absolutely central. They were tasked with drawing up its program and principles, which led pretty directly to writing the Communist Manifesto.
Before the manifesto, though, there was another work, critiquing Proudhon.
Right, The Poverty of Philosophy, 1847. It was Marx drawing a line in the sand, distinguishing his scientific materialist approach from what he saw as Proudhon's more petty bourgeois socialism, clearing the decks, intellectually speaking.
And then 1848, the manifesto, co-authored with Engels. Just immense historical significance.
Absolutely. Laying out the theory of class struggle, the critique of capitalism, the call for proletarian revolution, it becomes the foundational text.
And the revolutions of 1848 erupt right around then, giving it immediate context. Marx heads back to Germany.
Yes, the revolutions break out, and he goes to Cologne. He starts advocating for the demands of the Communist Party in Germany.
Based on the manifesto.
Yes, but interestingly, he only pushed for 4 of the 10 points from the manifesto initially. He judged that in Germany, the first step needed was for the bourgeoisie to overthrow the old feudal system. Only then could the proletariat challenge the bourgeoisie.
So, tactical thinking.
Yeah.
Adapting the theory to the situation.
Exactly. He also starts another newspaper there, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, in June 1848, a radical daily funded by an inheritance he received, always trying to connect theory with political action.
It's a constant theme. Now, the source also mentions something maybe less expected, Marx's later interest in mathematics.
Yeah, it's a fascinating sidebar. Engels mentions Marx's mathematical manuscripts in the preface to Anti-Düring.
What was he studying?
Apparently, he spent quite a bit of time, roughly 1873 to 1883, really digging into the foundations of differential calculus. His notes were eventually published.
Why calculus? Any ideas?
The speculation is he wanted to use it for maybe a more rigorous quantitative analysis in economics, trying to find mathematical laws underlying his economic theories. Some scholars see parallels in his approach to differentiation with mathematicians like Hadamard, seeing it almost as a dialectical process itself.
Wow, it just shows the sheer range of his intellect, doesn't it? Beyond politics and economics.
It really does. Never stop trying to understand the fundamental structures of things, it seems.
The source also gives us a glimpse into his personal life. Obviously, his marriage to Jenny von Westphalen was central.
Very central. By all accounts, a deep bond. They had 7 children, but tragically only 3 daughters survived to adulthood. Jenny Caroline, Jenny Laura, and Eleanor.
Such hardship.
Immense hardship, poverty, exile, loss. Yet his son-in-law, Paul Lafargue, described him as a very loving father.
There's also that rumor, isn't there, about an illegitimate son.
Yes, Freddie, allegedly with their housekeeper, Helene Demuth. It remains debated. The evidence isn't conclusive either way.
So, a life marked by intellectual intensity but also profound personal struggles. And looking back at his intellectual journey, the source maps out those key influences really clearly.
It does. You've got Hegel, obviously. The dialectic, though, Marx famously flipped it on its head, grounding it in materialism.
Right. Then classical economists.
Smith, Ricardo, he engaged deeply with their work, even while critiquing it. French socialists, too, Rousseau, Saint-Simon, Fourier, Proudhon. He learned from them, argued with them.
And the earlier materialists.
The young Hegelians, like Feuerbach and Bauer initially, also 18th century French materialism. And you absolutely have to include Engels' work on the working class and early class analysis from French liberals.
It even mentions the possible influence of his Jewish background on his ethics or materialism.
It raises it as a possibility, yeah. It's complex, but it shows the sheer range of factors potentially feeding into his thought.
And all these threads weave together into his core methodology, historical materialism being key.
Absolutely central. The idea that material conditions, how we produce things, how society is organized economically, that's the base that shapes everything else. Politics, law, culture, ideas.
He critiqued Hegel's spirit for obscuring this.
Yeah, for obscuring the reality of human physical activity, labor, as the real driving force. And his method was often critique challenging speculative philosophy, seeing metaphysics as often masking material interests as ideology.
And his view of human nature, tied to labor.
Fundamentally. For Marx, what makes us human is our ability to consciously transform nature through labor, or labor power. He used that famous comparison.
The spider, the bee, and the architect.
Exactly. The worst architect plans the structure beforehand, unlike the bee, building its cell instinctively. That conscious design, that transformation of the world through planned work is uniquely human for him.
Okay, so bringing this all together, wrapping up this deep dive into Marx's early formation, what are the really crucial takeaways for you?
Well, first, just how much those early years mattered. His family, his education in that politically charged time, his early encounters with censorship, it all laid the groundwork.
Right. It wasn't just abstract thinking.
No. Second, that intense engagement with Hegel and then the break with the young Hegelians, that was absolutely vital for developing his own materialist viewpoint. Third, the partnership with Engels. You can't overstate its importance. And finally, the combination of deep study, especially political economy, with his practical experiences in journalism and political organizing, that blend is key. Understanding these roots, I think, is essential if you want to really grasp his later work and why he had such a massive impact.
Absolutely. You need that context. It makes the later, denser stuff much more understandable. Okay, so final thought for you, our listener, to chew on.
Go on.
Given Marx's early focus on material conditions, on labor, on transforming the world, how do those core ideas still echo today? When we think about inequality, about technology changing work, about social justice, good question. Are there insights from his early journey, maybe unexpected ones, that could help us think about our current challenges? Something to ponder, definitely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.